Welcome to our 30th episode of Neurodiversity in a Nutshell. My name is Aryan, and today we're super excited to host Alexander Blum in our third interview episode. Alexander Blum is adjunct faculty at San Francisco State University. He's an adjunct lecturer teaching introductory special education courses in the Department of Special Education, including the nature of autism spectrum and introduction to disability. After obtaining his PhD in special education, his teaching is at the graduate and undergraduate level at San Francisco State and the high school level as well in the Fremont Unified School District have provided high quality instruction to students interested in learning about the fascinating world of autism, neurodiversity, and special education. Dr. Blum's research focuses on various cognitive and sociocultural interventions for autism spectrum, but additionally focuses on improving such tools and tasks for any individual. This approach to recognize learning differences rather than deficits, which is one of the main tenets of the neurodiversity movement, has the potential to improve learning outcomes for neurodivergent and neurotypical individuals alike. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Blum.
Great to be here, Aryan.
Yeah, so I'm just going to hop into the first question. It's just kind of like an introductory question. Many researchers have a personal connection to their chosen field. For example, Alzheimer's disease researchers are connected because of close family members and affected relatives. And in previous interviews, Alenka Villarreal, who founded Magical Bridge Foundation to create inclusive infrastructure and safe spaces, had her own neurodivergent children. What inspired you to become passionate about your chosen field?
Okay. Well, education, broadly speaking, is my chosen field. In college, I was trying to figure out what to major in. I shifted a lot. I thought I was going to be an engineer. Didn't happen. But I ended up finding psychology, and that was fun. I enjoyed it a lot. But within psychology, I took this class called the Psychology of Learning. And this was like my first glimpse of cognition, thinking, meaning making. And I never thought about the black box before this class. And the curiosity just kept growing and growing. And then I started looking at people and education. And I started like, how do we promote thinking, cognition, learning, and people's differences in meaning making? And it was just the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen. And I wanted to go into teaching, but I didn't have much experience. So I volunteered at a school with kids with special needs, special education classes. And I started seeing very diverse meaning making systems. And I was like, wow, this is fascinating to me. How are everyone making meaning in such unique ways? So I started to get into it more and more. I went to a credential program. And within that, they said, oh, there's opportunity in special ed. I was like, oh, that's great. And they said to me, for your master's, you could do a comprehensive exam or a thesis. And I was like, I don't want to take an 8-hour exam ever if I don't have to. Thesis sounds great. And that's where I discovered autism. I never had a relative with autism or knew anyone who was autistic or anything of the sort. I barely knew what autism was beyond Rain Man and Mercury Rising. But there was a lens to it that caught my attention as I read about it. I went in it strictly I wanted a job. There's opportunity. In 2010, people were not talking about autism like they are in 21. But I saw this different meaning making system, this very neurodivergent meaning making. And then I was like, oh my gosh. And I was in an English class and I was working with autistic kids in English, and I taught them stories and meaning making and inferencing, all this stuff. And I saw their view of the world through that. And I was blown away. And hearing their interest in music and arts and STEM or STEAM. And I was like, atypical cognition can be beautiful. So it was really like a real interest more than altruism like, that's what really got me inspired and passionate about how do we promote this for all sorts of people.
Yeah, so just a quick follow-up question on that. So, you talked about like teaching students in like various classes and things like that. How did that kind of like inform what your research was later on? So, those practices in like the classroom and learning from different lenses, how did that influence, what you decided to research later on?
Oh, well, I actually was going to do behavior intervention. That
Oh,
was my original goal. I was going to do an incredible behavior intervention that was going to save the world. And then my advisor said, your thesis is not going to save the world. I was like, oh, very deflating. She goes, what you should focus on is how are you going to help your class? Do a thesis that helps your classroom. Don't try to save the world with your one thing. Help your classroom. I was like, okay. Well, I taught English, right? Reading comprehension was the big thing in an English class, right? And I wasn't trained in literature, but I was trained in how to make information accessible to diverse learners. And I could do that with composition, especially writing about narratives. So I went in there, I started talking to students. I saw their challenges with literacy, and I was like, how do I do something about this? My autistic kids especially struggled with narrative. I noticed that too. I was like, wow, this is not a fun experience for you. That doesn't make anything good happen, right? It has to be a meaningful experience. Ideally, you want learning to be meaningful, not like filling out an insurance form. You want to feel like an author. You don't feel like an author when you fill out an insurance form. You don't say, I'm the author of this form, right? So I don't want my classwork activities to be insurance forms and make it miserable. So I started researching what promotes literacy, and there was an article by Gately, 2008, right? And it said, comics can be helpful. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I did not read comics as a kid. I do not read comics now. I'm not very interested in comics for personal reading. But gosh, they're telling me it works. Let's try it out. So I got an X-Men comic called Magneto's Testament. It was a 1-of-1. Marvel only made, they should have made more of them, but it's Magneto's life in the Holocaust. That's historically accurate. No mutant powers. It even has a teacher guide in the back. And I was teaching a unit on Holocaust. So I was like, okay, let's do this instead of night, or in addition to night, I mean. And I was like, okay. I can't afford to buy everyone a book. So I photocopied the book for every student. Large print for visually impaired students, and, customized it long or tall, depending on what students wanted. But I had unlimited photocopy privileges. It was pretty exciting. So I did that. And then I taught my normal narrative, lesson. And I had never seen my students this way before. It was like a renaissance. They were engaged, sharing their experiences, talking about, it's like, wow, the comics are doing, especially for my autistic students, telling me things like, I can see the story now. I understand the story now. Or just appreciating the aesthetic of the art and how rich it, and I was like, really? That is wild. And I was like, okay, well, let's do a thesis on comics for autistic kids and compare comic versus text. So I took a reading inventory, and, it's like one of those grade level passages where if you get 6 wrong, stop. If you get 2 wrong, keep going. And it's like, this is a 3rd grade passage. This is a 4th grade passage. And you keep going up until you stop and say, that's your reading level. But there's multiple graded passages. There's like 4 4th grade passages, 4 10th grade, right? So I took half of them and I turned them into comics. I hired an illustrator and said, keep words the same, just add sequential images. You could do it like one sentence at a time. You know, these turned out to be like 5-panel comics. And I had kept the same comprehension questions and I gave them to autistic kids. And I said, you guys, technically in my head, should be scoring the same, regardless, because that's your reading level. But lo and behold, they scored higher on the comic with the questions. But they're the same grade level text. I was like, wow, your meaning making was impacted by the format. It's how? Why? How could that make such a big difference? How does giving comics make such a big difference in the classroom? I did another one, Fahrenheit 451, in graphic novel form. Again, people were saying things like, you know, this one character killed herself in the story. You know, they raided her house and she lit herself on fire with her books. And then, you know, I was like asking inference questions, you know, why did she do that? And usually I get crickets or people don't care. And then I started getting responses like, she wanted to die with the history of books. Like these kind of like grandiose inferences. And I was like, holy cow, comics really do something special. So I wanted to get a PhD in it, study it more. That's probably a little more than what you asked me, but
no, that was amazing. That was so great.
I don't read comics. And yeah. I mean, I study them from a cognitive perspective, sure, but like, I don't have an affinity for comics, but I know it works. I've seen it work.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because we're talking a lot about like research and practice, right? Like just like instruction and then implementation. And we kind of also talked about like the flip side of it, of like how practice can also influence research, which is really fascinating to see that teaching in classrooms can even impact the way that we research, even theses and things like that. So yeah, it was absolutely great. But yeah, I guess now that you've kind of gotten that classroom experience, now you've, you know, researched your theses, you've done multiple papers. Beyond that, how do you kind of bring that back to the classroom, especially with teaching at FUSD now?
Well, the one thing that I got, so when I started my PhD, I again wanted to do an intervention, save the world. And my advisor at the time said, you didn't come to get a PhD to save the world with the intervention. I was like, oh, that's kind of what I was, made this PowerPoint for you. This is literally what I was thinking. But you're telling me I didn't, so tell me why I did come. And she said, you came for a philosophy, came for a lens, came to train to develop that. That will let you critique, evaluate any intervention. In fact, interventions will always come and go. There's always going to be some new hot way of doing something. But your philosophy is what's going to allow you to disentangle and engage with things in different ways. I was like, holy cow, that's wild. So the main thing I try to bridge is that philosophy. Not any specific intervention per se, but bringing in a historical lens and understanding to the landscape of, for example, literacy. You know, a lot of these constructs that we try to improve math skills, literacy skills, whatever skills, you know, we're deciding what these constructs are, and they kind of are like moving targets. You know, what does reading comprehension mean? Right? You know, you go into the 50s and 60s, reading comprehension really meant literal comprehension, right? How many questions can you get right on the test based on facts? I don't want your world knowledge. Don't bring in your cultural relevance. We don't need, I want a summary of every detail, and the more details you include, the more you comprehended. Very operationalist, kind of behaviorist. And then in the 70s, right, the cognitive revolution happened. People were wondering what's in the black box. What does reading comprehension mean from a cognitive perspective? And people started to say, oh, well, students have world knowledge now. Students have funds of knowledge. How do we bring in the cultural relevance and the rich ideas with the text? And you take that idea and then all of a sudden you go, is it student-centered? Is it curriculum-centered? Right? And you get these ideas and you start asking these questions. So it always changes. So I lost track of your original question. Oh, bridging research to practice. So bringing in a philosophy helps you disentangle these things as you work with them. So, you know, you'll get a curriculum at a high school, right? And you can look at that curriculum and ask yourself, you know, what is it really, how does it see reading comprehension? How does this test see learning, right? Here's a fun example. Disposition versus achievement. Okay, so achievement is like high stakes tests. You've probably taken many of those. Stanford 9, I don't know if those exist, California, Golden State exam. These are state exams, you know, that have high consequences for schools that are based on how well you do. SAT, achievement, right? You know,
Yeah.
Deficit oriented, right? You are lacking it, right? So how does the test see learning? It sees learning as something you can or cannot do, right? You either got it right or wrong. This is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And this always bothered me. I never liked seeing learning this way. You know, you take a history of autism, you start off in that operationalist 50s, 60s stage, right? Autism was really, you know, pushed in the 40s or not started, autistic people always existed, but more formally researched in the 40s. And it was seen as this, you know, institutional view because that's where it was found.
Yeah.
And then you go into these Freudian theories later on, and you get the refrigerator mother, and cold mothers give birth to autistic kids, and it's the mother's fault, and it's very psychoanalytic. And then, you know, it kind of transforms. No, there's cognitive theories. They have mind blindness. They don't take perspectives. You know, they can or cannot. There's a deficit in perspective taking. No, it's a deficit in social skills. No, it's a deficit in understanding context with central coherence theory. But it's a deficit, this deficit, that. But in the 2000s, I came across a phrase called processing bias. And the language started to shift. Instead of saying that autistic kids had a deficit in deficit in global thinking.
Global thinking, yeah.
You know, the forest beyond the trees, theme, world knowledge-based thinking. They said, slow down. Maybe it's takes longer to do global thinking. Maybe it's a time thing. There was this meta-analysis that looked at all these studies that looked at global versus local thinking across all sorts of domains. And they said, wow, when you look at response time, statistically, they are slow, therefore have deficits. But then they said, what if we change the outcome measure to accuracy? And look, instead of time-based.
I see.
And then all of a sudden there wasn't a difference statistically.
I see.
And the takeaway is that, oh, maybe it's not a deficit in global, maybe it takes time. And real life just doesn't give you that affordance.
Also, there's always that possibility of different learning mediums that can influence.
And then all of a sudden, it's like you take the medium differences. It's like, wait a minute, if medium makes an impact, and now you're telling me it's a thinking style, not deficit versus able or not able, but it's a style. There's a local preference. Global doesn't get as much action, but maybe the medium can change these things. I was like, whoa. And they called it a local processing bias. I like disposition more than bias, but it's the same idea. There's a tendency. There's a visual processing disposition, a visual thinking tendency.
Yeah.
There's a systems thinking. Now I'm seeing research in the 2000s that are talking about styles instead of deficits. And I was like, whoa, we just changed the language. Now we changed the meaning of learning. So if we have a test that measures achievement versus a test that measures disposition, what does the test say about learning, right? Disposition is context-based, right? Contexts can change your disposition or alter it or reinforce it. Achievement is so It's like we live in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And I never liked that. So me bringing perspectives of, for example, disposition instead of achievement. It's not what the kid can or cannot do. It's what they did that day in the given circumstance. But if we had altered it, we could have got something different out of them. Change the format, maybe. Get something different out of them.
Yeah.
It's weird when you change the format and you don't see the deficit. Was there ever a deficit? I asked this to a professor, and she said to me, there is a deficit. I was like, but I just gave this whole argument and song and dance about disposition. And she said, no. The deficit is right there. See how they're low? They're scoring low. I said, but if you give them a comic with comic experience, it goes up. And she goes, yeah. But the deficit, I see the deficit. And I was like, what are you trying to say? She says, we got to the point. Deficit is situated. It is not absolute. It is not in a vacuum. It has context. So deficit does exist in certain contexts, but it doesn't exist in all contexts necessarily.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, so bringing that into schools, how do you see the learner, right? How do you see their learning? These are all things that professionals need to harness their philosophy to engage with students in these ways.
Yeah. So what happens, like for example, the professor that you just mentioned, what happens when those philosophies collide in a school system and things like that? And I know we've had multiple discussions before about how even in Fremont, there have been such discussions and, differences in thought and philosophies. And how do like school departments kind of reconcile and try to move past that?
I'll tell you what happens when you don't reconcile. When you don't reconcile, it means you're not being constructive, right? You'll have the conspiracy of best intentions, right? Look at someone says, I want my autistic student or learning disabled student or whatever, to thrive. Great, we all want that. Okay. I want him to thrive so he could be like everyone else. Now it's getting a little murkier. It's like, well, I do want them to thrive and I do want them to, thrive like their peers. But then it gets murky where it says, want to get them out of special ed into the mainstream and kind of wean them off of special ed. And then it gets murkier. It's like, well, it's a little ableist now because you're kind of putting normative supremacy at the top. And if you're disabled, you're kind of less than normative. But it's with the best intentions. I want the student to thrive. You could do, it's like separate settings for special education, right? Best of intentions. This is, I want the kid to learn. But then you have separate is inherently unequal kind of thinking versus, no, this is a unique program for their unique learning needs. And then things get a little murkier. So best of intentions. My advisor called them the conspiracy of good intentions. The context was in that example, and the original example was, they teach words first and sentences and paragraphs, then the high flying stuff later in this linear fashion with the best of intentions. But it's like, no, you can do everything all at the same time. In this case, everyone wants the student to thrive, but how does that happen? And what are the reference points of success? These are different for people. And when they collide and you're not constructive, it doesn't go anywhere. Nothing is going to happen overnight. Nothing is a silver bullet, but I think there needs to be a towards. We need to move towards inclusion. We need to move towards neurodiversity. It's not that deficits or medical models are like the enemy. I think that's a mistake that people jump to, right? Social model, neurodiversity, deficit versus difference. It's only a difference. And I was over here preaching local and context, but I think it's a mistake to think that there are no challenges.
Yeah.
I think it's a mistake to think that impairments are somehow negated. I think it's a problem neurodiversity will face, because people will say, oh, you want to be different, you don't need services. You're just different, right? In the spiteful kind of way. And it's like, yes, but it doesn't mean I don't benefit from support.
Just like any other person.
Just like any other person.
Yeah.
And, for insurance to work and diagnoses to work and, services, there has to be a problem.
Yeah.
For it to kick in, you can't just be let's say you're autistic in class and you're doing great and there are no challenges and you want an IEP, you got to show that you're messing up somewhere or bring in a physician's note that you're autistic, but there has to be a deficit to address, which I get, especially for insurance. It's kind of hard to tell an insurance company, help give money for my difference.
Yeah.
They're not going to exactly, want to jump on that.
Yeah.
So I get it, but it's not, and there are problems, in the most extreme form, you get eugenics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, curing disabilities, curing differences. This is extreme. But the medical model can lend itself to that. It doesn't have to. I think it's all about a merging of frameworks. I think the more diversity in the composite of the framework, the more potential for enrichment it has.
Yeah. I think in general, it's kind of similar to what we were just talking about. It's like, it's really just context dependent. It's about dispositions in specific contexts, like insurance or businesses or things like that. And even on a macro level, it does apply. Yeah.
And then how do you navigate that context?
Yeah.
It can be tough, but it illuminates, like, you'll take, let's say you have an autistic kid whose special interest area is anime. It loves anime. I'm biased. I like anime too. And he's talking about a show, a movie. Let's go with Cowboy Bebop. And he's saying everything about the characters and the storyline. Oh, this rich information. And the people in the conversation who, let's say they like it too, they're like jiving. Great conversation. Maybe even it's an anime club during lunchtime at school, and they're just going to town. Then you see the same kid in the conversation, and it's not about their special interest area. It's about, I don't know, sewing, arbitrary example. And you start seeing challenges in their social skills, not really knowing when to shift topics or not knowing when to, push further, or kind of missing the cues. Other side gets a little frustrated and the other kid starts missing the frustration points and kind of just keeps, and all of a sudden deficits start to show, but they don't show in that other context in the same way when it's about this. And obviously life is not all about preferred activities, but you can't say there's a necessary domain general deficit. So domain general meaning it doesn't matter the context.
Yeah.
And that's a recent contention in research right now, right? Do autistic kids have a domain general deficit in narrative meaning making, inferencing, character analysis, or is it context? And the results are pretty mixed out there. You'll see format comparisons and brain studies and time trials, sequencing activities, all these things that tap into narrative in different ways. And some studies will say, yeah, the format matters. And some studies say, no, they're just as problematic regardless of format, depending on the outcome measure. And it's mixed. And, I think, my dissertation brought in the variable, and Neil Cohn in Netherlands was talking about similar ideas. Well, it depends on your comic experience.
Yeah.
Right. And that's context. That's context. And it's like, oh, so that means comics aren't universal.
Mhm.
Oh, you got to teach it. Oh, right. And this is like newer. So, you know, and there's people trying to challenge, you know, the idea of like, you can't just put a comic and like, you put an iPad in front of someone and you say, go, why aren't your grades better? It's like, well, how do I use an iPad? How do I develop a literacy for an iPad? Okay, how do you develop a literacy for comics? It can look pretty disjointed. Like, where do I start? The boxes are all different on how do I navigate? I don't know. I don't mess with comics, right? And so you're not gonna, right? Versus someone who's very experienced, who can walk forward and backwards and, you know, engage with it in such a way that is very fulfilling. So I think context matters. Maybe some things are domain general, but I like to move towards a dispositional context situated view. I'd like to move towards a situated view of meaning making. Situated context.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of just bouncing off that a little bit more, just that, you know, theory, implementation, research to practice, you know, all of those things. What advice do you give to, you know, other researchers interested in connecting theory and implementation in pretty much any field, not necessarily just, you know, special education, even just literacy or math or any other sort of just practice field?
Well, I love what you said earlier. I think there's a misconception, an assumption that research to practice means research to practice. But you brought up another point. What about practice to research? Then research to practice, and then practice to research, and then research, right? In this kind of interactional.
Informing both ways, yeah.
Yes. I think that is probably the best advice I can give, that you don't need to start in any one point. Start wherever you want. Start in the practice, start in your experiences, start in literature, or let them inform one another. Have an open conversation and be patient with yourself. Navigate. You know, here's one thing that would have been nice I was told that I wasn't told. When you get an article, you don't need to understand the whole thing, especially on the first round.
Like a research paper?
Yeah.
I see.
You could understand 10% of it, and that 10% might be very meaningful. And on the second lap, maybe you'll get a little more. Maybe you'll step away from it for a few months and come back to it. You don't need to read it once. And you don't need to get it all on the first try or the second try. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Or there might be some parts in the lit review where you're like, yeah. And then you get to the methods, you're like, whoa, what does this mean? And then you get to discussion, you're like, yes. Or you get to lit review and you're like, okay, I've seen this already. You get to the methods, oh, I understand the design. I have no idea what these stat models mean, but I get the general premise of how they controlled for things. Oh, and the discussion, I get so much more. Then maybe more training time goes and you start to look at it, oh, I get the lit review. I've read 1,000 autism lit review. Oh, the methods, yeah, I've seen this design pre-post trials before.
Yeah.
Oh, I've seen these numbers before. Oh, wait, you're telling a different story from these numbers that other people don't usually make the same leaps from. Or is that okay? Then you start asking yourself questions and then questioning things. You know, something as easy as saying, hey, I tested 5th graders, then I tested 6th graders, then I tested 7th graders, then I tested 8th graders, and I noticed 6 do less than 7 do less than 8. So that means it's developmental. And it's like, well, you tested individual grades individually. That doesn't necessarily mean it's developmental. You would use a different model that looked at it across rather than just standalone, right? Can you tell the same there? And you start asking yourself questions. And then you start being critical consumer of information. And that's okay. To be a critical consumer, you don't have to believe everything. You just need to know where they're coming from. And you could disagree with where they're coming from. And you could say things like, that's a stretch, or I don't buy it. And that's okay. It's about converging evidence. It's not about any one thing you read or any one thing you think.
Yeah.
And this is all a process, right? You have to be patient with yourself, but enjoy the ride, right? There's a sort of, if you're surfing, there's waves that are better than others. There's ebbs and flows in the sea. You kind of read the sea, right? I feel like being a scholar at any age in life, it's just somebody who's trying to pursue and create information, right? That's what a scholar is. There's going to be some times you're going to get like a gold mine of articles that are just like, that's right. And then you're going to get a slew that's like, wow, I just spent 10 hours and I moved an inch forward. That's okay too. It's all okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely great advice. And I know that I've taken it myself as well at multiple stages in our conversations in the past. So yeah, it's just great to hear. Kind of moving back to some of your research papers and, all of that we've kind of talked about in tidbits, but kind of just spending a little bit more time on. One of your major research objectives is to learn more about inferential thinking. And I know you mentioned comics specifically, but did you ever consider, a different type of narrative comprehension? Like you mentioned, maybe digital technology or anything. But I guess my question is, what was specifically appealing about comics compared to, other forms of, I guess, alternative media?
Well, over time, my definition of narrative has broadened dramatically, for starters. In fact, Jerome Bruner in the 90s wrote this article called The Narrative Construction of Reality. Life is a narrative. It's like, okay, that makes sense. Everything is a story. We house our experiences and memories in the form of narratives.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. Inferencing is the foundation of narrative meaning making, right? Otherwise, everything's disjointed. You got to make it about why things are happening and how they're happening and from different vantage points of how they're happening. The original question was,
why comics over everything?
Oh yeah. And I did think of film. I did think of audio. I guess what I really like is you can control time very easily in comics. Like with a film, you gotta stop, rewind, fast forward, right? That's how you control time. But in a comic, and sound too, right?
Sound is the same thing, yeah.
Yeah. But with a comic, I could see the past, present, and future all at the same time.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
You can control time more, or navigate time, not control, navigate time. Very easy. Now, someone says, what about textbook? I can just read the line back and read the line forward. Okay, it's true, but not too often are you reading two lines at the same time.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to do, yeah.
But I could look at two panels at the same time.
Yeah, I see.
So I think that's a very nice inherent scaffold, especially if we're saying that global takes time. And global is like facial integration, context integration, memory integration, lots of integration to understand context. Then real life is too fast. And I'm not going to stop and play a movie to stare at someone's face every 5 seconds.
Yeah.
But with a comic, I can take my time. I could really soak in what is being represented. I think that's pretty unique about narratives in the sequential image format, like comics.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. I didn't even think of that. Yeah. Yeah, moving on to, I think, a paper that you wrote or co-authored about question-answer relationships. Yeah, one of the things that you talked about was integrative inferential reasoning. And it sounds like a very nice concept, but I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more about like what purpose does that kind of assessment serve, and what does that also kind of look like, if that makes sense?
It was my way of sticking it to the man. So the man would be achievement, dominant force. Everyone's interested. What can autistic kids do or can't do? Or what can a learner do and can't do? And I want a test that will precisely see what they can and cannot do so we can remediate and get them to where they want to be. I was like, none of that. I don't want that. I want something different. And I know all the literature says they're great with local inferences and they have deficits in global inferences. And I was like, but I don't want to measure that. I don't want to measure, because I don't believe that's your ability. And I don't like a sort of zero, like a achievement view of ability. You know, I didn't like it, and I didn't want to use any test that did it. So I made a new test to measure disposition, particularly how much do you integrate your experiences with the story when answering questions about like, why did the character do this, or what's the lesson of the story, but as a disposition, not as an achievement. People push back on this a lot. I was already getting pushback that I was trying to replace text with comics. But now I'm getting pushback about achievement versus disposition. And they're like, how can you tell the difference? They're scoring low or high, and that's what it is. And I was like, yeah, but my questions are opinion questions. Why do you think the character did this? What do you think the lesson is? How could someone get that wrong? What is wrong? You're telling them you learned the wrong lesson, I guess, or you said the wrong thing for why the character stole something, or what does that mean? So I made a scale using different theorists from the 70s through the 90s into the early 2000s, and I created this taxonomy of inferences that ranged from low to high. And I said, what's the most literal thing you could say to an inference question? Why did Timmy steal the car? Well, the most literal thing you could say is, I don't know. Hence, right? Because you didn't tell me. And if you did tell me, I wouldn't need to infer. So I don't know is the most literal thing you could say to an inference question.
Yeah.
So then it's okay, let's make an inference. It's like, let's say you heard a story about kids kicking a three-legged dog. And they go, what's the lesson of the story? And the kids say, don't kick three-legged dogs. And it's like, true. That is a lesson. But it's a very literal lesson. Kind of, that's literally what took place in the story. Very local lesson, detail-driven, right? Very based in the story. I was like, okay. What would be a global thing? I don't know. Bullying is like the worst thing in the world. Something from your experiences and schemas and scripts that says this is an example of bullying. Not all places see kicking a dog as bullying. Some people go, it's just a dog, like a rat on the street, and it doesn't matter. Other places see dogs very differently, right? Depends on your experiences and context. So talking about bullying or altruism, right? These are all global, right? And I was like, so there's no right or wrong. It's just degrees of integration. People push back. They go, what do you mean? One is not necessarily true. I'm like, what does true mean? Some people integrate more than others. So I put a study together that said, hey, listen, what if I can manipulate this? What if I change the format? Do comic versus text, once again, just like in my thesis, only a little more sophisticated.
Yeah.
So I made new stories that were word for word the same. Just one was with images and words in a comic format, and one was just like, paragraph format. Randomly assigned people to different groups, autistic and neurotypical. And I was, excited to show that comics helped. And I did a regression analysis, which basically says your predictor variable, does it predict scoring high or low? So I put in comic as a predictor, and I was thinking that it's going to be positive and significance, that when you get a comic, you score high. And it turns out they scored low, and I freaked out a little. It's like, this is not what I expected. So I did an interaction. I go, what if they're autistic and they got a comic? Does that lead to higher chances of scoring high? The unique combination of the two, right? My whole premise. And, lo and behold, it made it worse. And I really freaked out. And I'm like, oh my God, my entire PhD is on the premise that comics help autistic kids. And this is showing that it doesn't help anyone, especially autistic kids. I started to lose my mind. These numbers were going down. And then I added a third variable, comic experience. In my study, I asked all the participants 0 through 3, how much do you mess with comics? 0, I don't. 3 is a lot. One is a little. 2 is in between a little and a lot. And I did a 3-way interaction. And I said, what if you're autistic versus not? What if you got a comic versus text? And what about increasing comic experience up to 3? And all of a sudden, it became positive. It became so positive that when you had an autistic kid read the same story in a comic format with high comic experience, self-rated, there was no longer a difference between autistic and neurotypical kids' performance.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. They went up the scale. So on the one hand, I feel good because the scale is real now. It's like, look, it could have had no effect, but it's going up. But then I start to know, I realized like, wow, they became more global because the scale went from local to global and up. They became more global when you changed the context.
Yeah.
And it was non-invasive, right? It was just change the format, not the person. Changing the person's a little invasive. Change the context is less invasive. So I want to keep, moving this forward, but there is it's not domain general. One, I don't think. It supports a situated view of learning. We can, you put someone in a cold lab. There are studies that compare autistic neurotypical, and you read this little line that says, oh, neurotypical participants were measured at their school site, and the autistic kid was measured in a lab. That's a very different context.
It can affect whatever
it can affect
outcome is. Yeah.
Yes. Why aren't we thinking about this? I mean, obviously people are, but it's like these it could be as small as the room. It could be as much as the format. I was doing cognitive labs, think alouds with students, and I showed them a story. I said, which one do you like better? And they said the comic. I'm like, of course. Like, why? I'm like thinking because of the images. And she said to me, not the images. I was like, why do you like the comic better? She said it had less words. But they don't. They're word for word the same story.
Yeah.
The words are distributed over a sequence of images rather than a wall of text. And that changed it for her. Her whole perception. She thought it was a shorter story. But
wow.
It's not.
Yeah.
So, so that's what made me go into that, making that scale, to measure disposition and to show that you can change with context.
Yeah. Do you think these types of scales and these types of analyses, I know you've been focusing on like literacy and, English and things like that, but, Gately in that 2008 article also writes about CRA for math, concrete, representational, abstract types of teaching, with concrete being like actual objects, representational being, cards, and abstract being like just the numbers themselves. Do you think that similar scales and things can be designed in the context of other subjects like math as well?
Yeah, well, it depends if you're looking at it from a disposition or an achievement, right? When somebody gets the math problem wrong, or there's at different stages within this meaning making, you know, see it as a position in time more so than your ability, right? Maybe you had a bad day. Maybe you just are misunderstanding something really small. It's not really tapping into your knowledge, right? I think, taking a step back, I think scales, broadly speaking, wear a white coat. You know, the white coat, like a doctor.
Yeah.
People see a person in a white coat and then they tend to just, you know, validate everything they say because they have white coats and they must be speaking the truth because I don't have a white coat. I think tests and scales wear white coats. You know, you see a number of tests, you know, and this must be truth. You know, someone made that scale. There's biases in that scale. Someone chose the statistical model to model that, structure that data for that scale. And we've been wrong before. We don't give IQ tests to Black kids in California because it's a racist test or has biases built in. So we don't do that. We used to think that, you know, this one Black scholar at Cal was talking about the history of this IQ test, and they started seeing that Black people were scoring so low on this IQ test. And everyone was asking, why are the Black people scoring so low? What's going on with the Black people scoring? Why are the Black people scoring so low? What are they doing? Is it their fault? This. But no one was asking the question, is there something wrong with our test? Maybe that's the problem. Not the people that are taking the test. You know, we don't question because where's the white coat? It's okay to ask questions, be critical of assessments and scales, right? What does it mean? You know, you give a reading comprehension scale. It's like, okay, well, if you think learning is literal, then this is really just a literal scale and only gives you that flashlight of a vantage point. If you think learning is more related to my experiences, then that's another flashlight and that will be a different scale. Which one is more right than the other? Which is more valid? It depends on the story you tell with the numbers. I think people can tell bad stories, good stories, misleading stories. I mean, I could tell you, you know, the more TVs you have, the longer you live. That's true. A misleading story would be, better go buy some TVs, right? Because you'll live longer. But that's misleading because, you know, the model used to find that was a correlational model.
Correlation versus causation.
Right. But it's still statistics. And what I said was not untrue. The more TVs you have, the longer you live. It's not false.
Yeah.
It's misleading. But it's not false. You know, my favorite, you know, those scratchers, the gambling ones?
Yeah.
I saw the best billboard. Buy 3 scratchers, 3 times the opportunity to win. That's true. It's absolutely true. You do have 3 times the opportunity to win by virtue of playing 3 times.
Yeah.
But people are going to misconstrue it as I'm 3 times likely to win. Misconstrue it. It's like, no, that's not what it said.
Yeah.
I know you saw the 3 and the times and the win with this, but that opportunity, like a big part.
Yeah.
Right. And people are, you know, could be very reckless with narratives, you know, and the stories you want to tell with these numbers for different agendas. So you got to be wary of these things and question these things. They're all just flashlights at the end of the day. Theories, frameworks, scales. They're just flashlights that are just looking at things from different vantage points. And it's not about whether you agree or disagree. You just need to understand where they're coming from and make your own decision.
Yeah. So kind of bouncing off of that, I've attended a couple of your undergrad lectures in the past few weeks. And yeah, just like going off of just flashlights. We talked about flashlights very generally with like just research and practices and different study designs and things like that. But when it comes to neurodiversity or just like the recognition of different frameworks for autism, what's so important about recognizing these different flashlights?
They're all a truth, right? If you have, let's say you had like a an autistic kid in a social breakdown. Shine one flashlight on it from the mind blindness theory of mind camp, right? You'll say it broke down because he didn't take the perspective of the other people. Taking a executive function kind of flashlights, and which is about regulation, timing, management. And you say, oh, it broke down because he didn't know how to shift topics. He just kept going and going and going and going. You got central coherence theory that says, local strengths, global challenges, therefore context challenges. So it broke down because he didn't understand the context that was taking place, and he just kept going his own way. They're all looking at the same thing. They're all seeing their own truth. Is one more right or wrong than the other? I mean, they're all perspectives. It's up to you to decide which one is most appropriate for the given context. When it comes to neurodiversity, you take a medical model, you could see the deficits more clearly. And maybe that's important for that given context. I need to know the deficits.
For accessibility services or insurance companies.
Or just like at home, I want to help my kid.
Yeah.
I see these challenges, these intense breakdowns, these intense deficits. Medical model could be very useful for intervention and supporting and seeing these deficits and understanding these deficits. Other times, the social model might be more appropriate to see learning and meaning making, and not seeing a deficit, but seeing it more as difference, because that's more appropriate for a given context. So but you're the one deciding that based on all the flashlights that are illuminating this phenomenon. And you're navigating the flat, but they're all just perspectives. I mean, truth is a funny thing, right? What does that mean? So I think the best thing is to be a critical consumer of information, yes, to be a critical thinker, yes, but to learn to empower yourself with decision-making about appropriateness. I think professionals, one thing I tell my grad students especially is like, listen, you don't have to agree with everything I say. Just understand the flashlights, because when you're in the field, it's just you in the field making decisions with your team, of course, but you're deciding what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and how to navigate that. It's not for me to tell you what to do. It's for me to inform your toolkit so you know what to do, when to do it in the right context.
Yeah.
And flashlights and neurodiversity is a flashlight in itself, right? From a social model perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But, in extreme context is, are you going to look at a self-injurious behavior and go, no, it's just a difference. He just likes to smash his head against the wall when he's overloaded. And it's like, no. This is a problem. He has regulation problems. Clearly, there's some sensory or some right? We need to figure out what this regulation issue is.
Yeah.
And crisis intervention to stop him from hurting himself. And then, we can worry about other things, right? But remember, crisis interventions are designed to be temporary. They're not designed to be long-term. Right? They're immediate and right. So, this is an extreme example, but I'm not going to look at that and call it a difference. Right? There's a real challenge and problem versus saying, oh, all the summaries he gives in English class are literal and he's not doing any inferential. That's okay. That's a problem. But we don't have to say there's a deficit. We could change the context.
Yeah.
Maybe try other approaches to pull it out of them, right? That's a different context altogether than someone hurting themselves. So you have to decide when you want to see something as a deficit versus a different. And maybe that same thing could be both in the different contexts.
Yeah.
This is another hard thing, like, what are you trying to say? They can't do it. It's a problem. Like, yes, but clearly when you make it about special interest areas, it's not the same problem. When you make it something forced in a lab that's contrived, it becomes a problem. I'm not saying there's nothing to worry about, but it's a moving target, But I think again, neurodiversity is going to have the problem where if it goes too far in the pendulum that it's all just copacetic differences, people are not going to see a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think autistic people want to be seen as like, oh, we have no needs of support of any kind. I think anyone who wants support would want support, right? Whether you're autistic or not, that's just a human thing, right? You know, you're gonna say the guy in the wheelchair, you just have a difference in legs. It's like, no, you put stairs in front of me, and now I can't get up. There's a problem. Yeah, your legs don't work. Okay, true. Let's move forward and put a ramp, and then I can get there. And yes, my legs still won't work, but you know, you're
situated.
Yeah, it's like, what did you do, right? So I think impairment and disability are not the same thing. I think disability is socially constructed given context. I think impairments can be internal, innate, right? If you're cerebral palsy, if you're paraplegic, or you know, these physical disabilities, or if you have intellectual disabilities and your brain doesn't operate in the same way, right? There are real differences that can lead to deficits, but depending on the context, you don't need to see it as such. Like white blood cell count, yeah, I'm not going to say there's a difference. Let's say there's a deficit. We need to get you more, right? That's not an appropriate place for a social model because these aren't people. These are biological cells, and we need to have a certain amount to live, and so on and so forth. But these are human beings we're talking about in learning. These are not white blood cells, right? It's different contexts altogether, right? And I think deficit versus difference should be taken situationally, not in absolute. You don't need to jump to one side or the other also. Don't be, you know, I think there's a quick assumption like one is evil, one is right, and whether it's medical, and you got to align yourself, and then, but that's not helpful. You could do both, right? I think medical models super helpful in some contexts, and I think social models helpful in other contexts. And I'm not trying to cop out. I think you have to be an independent, critical thinker to decide these things.
Critical consumer of information.
Yeah. You know, otherwise you're just going to get bullied by things, information. You don't want to be bullied by information. You want to be able to stand in front of it and know what you don't know, but have the confidence to pursue it.
Definitely. Yeah, we talked a lot about, I guess like one of my questions kind of coming up was like, what are the biggest challenges facing the neurodiversity movement? But we've kind of covered that. But I wanted to ask you about one thing that I know has been a major criticism of like the neurodiversity movement and the paradigm in general, which is gatekeeping. And it's a concept that comes up with like a lot of other like, you know, inclusive communities, for example, the LGBTQ plus community. And it's this idea of like, should we be like checking and like monitoring who is considered neurodivergent or neurodiverse, or should we just be letting anybody who feels that they have a difference in really modality or like their learning medium as a whole? And, you know, like you said, in different contexts, there's different choices that we have to make. But in general, do you think there should be something like that where there's some sort of gatekeeping for, you know, normative abilities or disabilities?
Everyone wants to be neurodivergent. It's hip. I think depending on your vantage point, right, you could see how it kind of cheapens it. Because I mean, I'm not saying there's this many, but like autism, you know, is about 2% of the country, reported wise. Obviously, there's more autistic people than are diagnosed, but reported wise, right?
Yeah.
You know, bipolar is 2.5%, right? These are small numbers that obviously don't represent the whole, right? But these are very small numbers. And these are very different lived experiences. You know, there's almost a plight in the shared culture, shared kind of community. And for people who haven't experienced those things, to say, oh, well, I think differently too, therefore we're the same, neurodiverse, one club. After that other group experienced all this plight. I could see from their perspective why, you want a membership club, right? You don't have a membership card where you just get free entry. I've been in this club my whole life, and now it's hip, and now you want to be in it. I could see that. On the other hand, it's not helpful to say not welcome.
Yeah.
So I think that's also a challenge. How broad does neurodiversity get to the point where everyone is neurodiverse and there's no such thing as neurotypical? There's no such thing as neurotypical? No. I'm sorry. Short answer, yes. Long answer, no. I think in the long run, not welcome is not welcome. And that's not helpful. Short answer, just because you make meaning differently doesn't mean you're autistic. Just because you make meaning differently doesn't mean you're bipolar. Just because you make meaning differently doesn't mean you're PTSD. Doesn't mean you're borderline. Doesn't mean you're about, right? So if you want to make it a spectrum of some sort, you still have the majority being within a certain range of diversity. Bipolar and autism are not in that middle. ADHD, these dyslexia, these are not in the middle. These are definitely on the ends. So how broad,
When you say spectrum, do you mean something like a bell curve or?
Yeah, like a bell curve.
I see.
Right? I think there needs to be a responsibility on both people's ends to negotiate the boundary of neurodiversity.
Yeah.
I don't think it should come from anyone. I don't think it should come from the neurodivergent side to only say, hey, we're drawing the line in the sand and this is what it is. Because neurodivergence is only a reference to neurotypical.
Yeah.
Right? Without any reference points, then, what exists? There's no light without dark and dark without light, right? These are
yin and yang.
Yeah. So I think let me tell you what's worse than a bad conversation. No conversation. So as long as we talk about it, we are moving towards something.
Yeah.
When we don't talk about it and we just stick to our gun and say, this is it, and there's no conversation, that's where conflict happens. I think over time, you'll get more people saying they're autistic or bipolar without being diagnosed. And that's scary to me personally, because you are not a trained clinician. You are not somebody who went to learn to be a diagnostician in that, right? Anecdotal stuff and mainstream stuff, and you read stuff and you might be right. I'm not saying you're wrong. But
self-diagnosis is just dangerous. Yeah,
you're not, it's like someone going to Psych 1 and then all of a sudden saying you are OCD and you're like, you don't have a PhD. What are you saying to me? Right? So I get worried that self-proclaimed identities can go fast and loose. Has the potential for that. And I think clinicians and educators or people who are in the spaces for these things, you can't say their training means nothing. Certainly more than your training as a layman. If we don't rely on experts if we think they're just invalid and I'm somehow truth because I am an individual with lived experiences, that's the other end of the pendulum, right? I think it needs to be a conversation between the person who thinks or believes they're neurodiverse and the clinicians and the educators or the people in those spaces who are trained to do that. And when those come together, right? But I don't know. I get scared. It's going to be hip to, there'll be some celebrity who says they're, some sort of neurodiverse, and it'll be hip. And it'll be nice in the sense it destigmatizes. That's great. all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I was happy and then sad yesterday. I'm totally bipolar, and that's okay because Elon Musk is, or whatever, is, and it's like, that's not what it is.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know because you're not a trained clinician. So I get worried about that. And I know that's a super medical model thing to say. Again, I think certain things are appropriate in certain contexts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I just have one last question. I think we've had a very enriching discussion about neurodiversity, your autism research, and context in general, just disposition versus achievement. But my last question is solely about you. What do you plan on pursuing in the next few years? What's to come? All sorts of things.
I love cognition, bringing it full circle. I learned some very powerful tools to measure types of cognition. The inferencing is one thing type, but there's other types. I'm working on a project that measures cognitive load, and different types of cognitive load, how intrinsic load, how much effort, extraneous load, how distracted, germane load, how much learning took place, and modeling that. I'm on another project that models a type of racism. So I like using my measurement skills to explore other fields of cognition. Within literacy and autism, I would really like to continue showing the power of comics. Again, I don't read comics. Doesn't mean I don't respect them.
Yeah.
And I want to teach comics, not use a comic and then teach a lesson. I want the lesson to be the comic.
Yeah.
That's something that is not done enough, and I really want to do. I would like to explore entrepreneurship, as I've been doing, consulting on projects and working with individuals, neurodiverse, neurotypical, in narrative meaning making. I like doing that a lot, and I want to continue teaching at the university. I love teaching higher ed, and while I'm at Fremont, especially, I want to continue understanding the transition from secondary school to higher ed for students, especially with learning differences. And how can I facilitate that process? So it's a few things. I guess the most important lesson I want to learn, which is going to seem so off related, is yes, love your passion. Yes, pursue your passion. Yes, when work doesn't feel like work, it's golden. But we need to practice establishing boundaries. I'm not saying work is not part of your life. I'm not saying it shouldn't be. I'm definitely not saying it's not supposed to be part of your identity, because it very much is for me. But there are times to go for a walk. There are times to watch $1 Million Listing on Bravo. There are times to socialize with your friends. And I think especially in the Zoom era, it's very easy to stack links. So you're busy all the time. And it's very easy to lose sight of other things that compose you, in addition to work and research and education and learning. Because at the end of the day, you want to be sustainable, right? You don't want to burn out. You want to, right? And I think boundaries are a good tool to help sustain what you're doing. And no matter what you do, establish boundaries. Say, it could be something as easy as saying, these days are for this and these days are for that.
Yeah.
Or it could be something like, I'm going to write for 1 hour a week, anything, just write, because writing is good for the soul. Or, everyone has different practices, but you have to make space for these things. And, some things are related, some things aren't, but I've been lost in my work before, and made it everything in the world. And it stopped being healthy. It stopped being as good as it could be, even, because it was just so entwined and narrow, and I lost sight of so many other things around me. And we gotta have, I hate the word balance. I don't like that. But we gotta be cognizant, aware of these things. I know you didn't ask that, but I thought that'd be
No,
good.
it's definitely important. And I think for anybody listening, it's obviously an important life lesson. Yeah, I totally understand. Yeah.
Yeah, but chase your dreams, go for it, right? I mean, gosh, you know, there's if you have faith in a secular sense, what does faith mean? It means just belief beyond reason, logic, and doubt. It could be religious. Religious faith is very powerful. But you got a faith in yourself. You got a faith in science. You got a faith in, you know, fill in the blank. But if you have faith in your identities, you can go so far. Right? Your identity as a scholar, your identity as a son, your identity as a, right? Believe in those identities, cultivate those identities, and be optimistic. Yeah.
Yeah. That's an amazing end to today's episode. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It has been a great conversation about so many different things. Probably can't count on my fingers and toes. But yeah, thank you so much for just being here today. I know it was not a work day. I know it was kind of just a weird timing as well, but it was great to have you on, and we'll hopefully see you in future episodes as well.
Very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.